Section 5, January 12th through January 14th. Chapter 1, Sunday, January 12th. Air as dense as molten iron. In the nightmare, Dom could not draw breath. A tremendous pressure bore down on him. He was choking violently. He was dying. He could not see much. His vision was clouded. Then 2 men came close, both wearing white vinyl decontamination suits with dark visored helmets similar to those of astronauts. One man was at Dom's right, frantically disconnecting the IV line, withdrawing the intravenous spike from his arm. The other man on the left was cursing the cardiological data on the video readout of the EKG machine. One of them unbuckled the straps and tore off the electrodes connecting Dom to the EKG, and the other lifted him into a sitting position. They pressed a glass to his lips, but he could not drink, so they tipped his head back and forced his mouth open and poured some noxious stuff down his throat. The men communicated with each other via radios built into their helmets, but they were leaning so close to Dom that he could hear their voices clearly, even through the muffling plexiglass of their dark visors. One of them said, "How many detainees were poisoned?" And the other said, "Nobody's sure yet. Looks like at least a dozen." The first said, "But who'd want to poison them?" And the second said, "One guess." The first said, "Colonel Falkirk. Colonel fucking Falkirk." The second man said, "But we'll never prove it, never nail the bastard." Flash cut, the motel bathroom. The men were holding Dom on his feet, forcing his face down into the sink. This time he understood what they were saying to him. With growing urgency, they were insisting that he vomit. Colonel fucking Falkirk had somehow had him poisoned, and these guys had made him drink a foul-tasting emetic, EMETIC, and now he was supposed to purge himself of the poison that was killing him. But even as sick as he was, he still could not puke. He gagged, retched, his stomach roiled. Sweat poured off him like melting fat off a broiling chicken, but he could not rid himself of the poison. The first man said, "We need a stomach pump," and the second said, "We don't have a stomach pump." They pressed Dom's face deeper into the porcelain bowl. The crushing pressure grew worse, and Dom could hardly breathe at all now, and hot, greasy waves of nausea washed through him, and sweat gushed from him. But he could not puke, could not. And then he did. Flash cut, in bed again. Weak, kitten weak. But able to breathe, thank God. The men in the decontamination suits had cleaned him up and strapped him to the mattress once more. The one on the right prepared a hypodermic and administered an injection of something apparently meant to counteract the remaining effects of the poison. The one on the left reconnected him to the intravenous drip from which he was receiving drugs, not nourishment. Dom was woozy, holding on to consciousness only with considerable effort. They hooked him to the EKG again, and as they worked, they talked. "Falkirk's an idiot. We can keep a lid on this given half a chance. He's afraid the memory block will wear off. He's afraid that some of them will eventually remember what they saw." Well, he may be right, but if the asshole kills them all, how's he going to explain the bodies? That's going to draw reporters like raw meat draws jackals, and then there'll be no way to keep the lid on. A nice memory wipe, that's the only sensible answer. You don't have to convince me. Gober and Falkirk's here about it. The dream figures faded away, as did their voices, and Dom passed into a different nightmare country. He no longer felt weak, no longer sick, but his fear exploded into stark terror, and he began to run with that maddening, slow-motion panic indigenous to nightmares. He did not know what he was running from, but he was certain that something was pursuing him, something threatening and inhuman. He could sense it right behind him, closer, reaching for him, closer. And finally he knew he could not outrun it, knew he must face it. So he stopped and turned and looked up and cried out in surprise, "The moon!" Dom was awakened by his own cry. He was in room 20, on the floor beside the bed, kicking, flailing. He got up and sat on the bed. He looked at his travel clock. 3:07 a.m. Shivering, he blotted his damp palms on the sheets. Room 20 was having precisely the effect on him that he had thought it would. The bad vibrations of the place stimulated his memory, made his nightmares more vivid and more detailed than ever. These dreams were radically different from all others he had ever known, for they were not fantasies, but glimpses of a past reality seen through a distorting lens. They were not dreams as much as they were memories, forbidden recollections that had been weighted and dropped into the black sea of his subconscious like dead bodies, encumbered with cement shoes and thrown from a bridge into the deeps. Finally, the memories had slipped out of the cement and were surging to the surface. He really had been imprisoned here, drugged, brainwashed, and during that ordeal, someone named Colonel Falkirk had actually poisoned him to prevent him from talking about whatever he had seen. Falkirk was right, Dom thought. Eventually we'll overcome the brainwashing and remember the truth. He should have killed us all. Sunday morning, Ernie purchased panels of plywood from a friend in Elko who owned a building supply. With his portable table saw, he cut the panels to fit the busted-out diner windows. Ned and Dom helped nail the plywood in place, and by noon they had completed the job. Ernie did not want to call a glazier and have the windows replaced because last night's phenomenon might recur. Until they knew what had caused the thunderous noise and shaking, installing new glass seemed foolhardy. In the interim, the Tranquility Grill would not be open. The Tranquility Motel also would be closed. Ernie did not want business to distract him from helping Dom and the others probe into the mystery of the toxic spill, quote-unquote. When the last of yesterday's check-ins departed later today, the motel would house only Ernie, Faye, Dom, and any other victims who, when contacted, might decide to journey to Elko County to participate in the investigation. He did not know how many rooms he might need for those fellow sufferers, so he decided to reserve all 20. For the time being, the Tranquility was less a motel than a barracks, where the troops would be quartered until this war with an unknown enemy was finally brought to a conclusion. When the diner was boarded up, they all got into the motel's Dodge van, and Faye drove them down to the interstate in just over a quarter of a mile east. Where she parked on the shoulder of the highway near the place that had a special attraction for Ernie and Sandy. The five of them stood along the guardrail, staring south, seeking communion with the landscape that might illuminate the past. The winter solstice was 3 weeks behind them, so the sunlight was almost as hard and flat and cold as fluorescent light. In the grip of January, the scrub and grass-covered plains, rugged hills, arroyos, and gnarled rock formations were basically trichromatic, rendered in browns and grays and deep reds, with only an occasional patch of white sand, snow, or vein of borax. The scene was stark and dreary under a sky that grew more clouded and gray by the hour, but it also possessed an undeniable, austere grandeur. Faye wanted very much to feel something special about this place, for if she felt nothing, that would mean the people who brainwashed her had totally controlled her, totally violated her. She allowed no room in her self-image for the concept of absolute submission. She was a proud, capable woman, but she felt nothing other than the winter wind. Ned and Dom appeared to be no more moved than Faye was, but she could see that Ernie and Sandy were receiving some cryptic message from the vista before them. Sandy was smiling beatifically, but Ernie had that look he got when night fell, pale, drawn with haunted eyes. "Let's go closer," Sandy said. "Let's go right down there." All five climbed over the guardrail and plunged down the steep embankment of the elevated road. They moved across the plain, 50 yards, 100, carefully avoiding the cold weather prickly pear which grew in profusion near the foot of the interstate, but soon disappeared in favor of sagebrush and bunch grass, which in turn gave way to another kind of grass, which was also brown but thicker, silkier. Portions of the plain were rocky and sandy and in the grip of worthless bristly scrub, while other portions were almost like small lush meadows, for this was a land in transition from the semi-desert of the south to the rich mountain pastures of the north. More than 200 yards from the interstate, they stopped on a patch of ground not appreciably different from surrounding territory. "Here," Ernie said with a shudder, jamming his hands in his pockets and pulling his neck down into the rolled sheepskin collar of his coat. Sandy smiled and said, "Yes, here." They spread out and moved back and forth across the ground. Here and there, in one shadowed niche or another, meager patches of snow lay hidden from the evaporating effect of the dry wind and from the cold winter sun. Those traces of winter, plus the lack of green grass and scattered late-blooming wildflowers, were the only things that made the landscape different from the way it had looked 2 summers ago. After a minute or two, Ned announced that he did indeed feel an inexplicable connection with the place, though it did not bring him peace as it did his wife. His fear became so acute that, expressing surprise and embarrassment at his reaction, he turned and walked away. As Sandy hurried after Ned, Dom Corvasis admitted that he was strangely affected by the place too. However, he was not merely frightened like Ned. Dom's fear, like Ernie's, was spiced by an unexplained awe and a sense of impending epiphany. Only Faye remained unaffected, unmoved. Standing in the middle of the area in question, Dom turned slowly in a circle. What was it? What the hell happened here? The sky had turned to gray slate. The blunt wind became sharp. Faye shivered. She remained unable to feel what Ernie and the others felt, and that inability increased her sense of violation. She hoped she would one day meet the people who had messed with her mind. She wanted to look in their eyes and ask them how they could have so little respect for the personal integrity of another human being. Now that she knew she had been manipulated, she would never again feel entirely secure. Stirred by the wind, the dry sagebrush made a scraping, rustling noise. Ice-crusted twigs clicked against one another with a sound that, fancifully, made Faye think of small, scurrying skeletons of little animals, long dead but somehow reanimated. Back at the motel, in the Block's apartment, Ernie and Sandy and Ned sat at the kitchen table while Faye made coffee and hot chocolate. Dom perched on a stool by the wall phone. On the counter in front of him lay the Tranquility Motel's registration book that had been in use the year before last. Referring to the page for Friday, July 6th, he began to call those who must have shared the unremembered but important experiences of that faraway summer night. In addition to his own name and that of Ginger Weiss, there were 8 on the list. One of them, Gerald Sacco of Monterey, California, had rented 2 rooms for himself, his wife, and 2 daughters. He had entered an address but no telephone. When Dom tried to get it from the area code 408 information operator, he was told the number was unlisted. Disappointed, he moved on to Cal Sharkle, the long-haul trucker, a repeat customer known to Faye and Ernie. Sharkle lived in Evanston, Illinois, a suburb of Chicago. He had included his telephone number in the motel registry. Dom dialed it, but discovered the telephone had been disconnected and that no new number was listed. We can check his more recent entries on the current registry, Ernie said. Maybe he's moved to another town. Maybe we have his new address somewhere. Faye put a cup of coffee on the counter where Dom could reach it, then joined the others at the table. Dom had better luck on his 3rd attempt when he dialed Alan Rykoff in Las Vegas. A woman answered and he said, "Mrs. Rykoff?" She hesitated. "I was Mrs. Rykoff. My name's Manatella now, since the divorce." "Oh, I see. Well, my name's Dominic Corvasis. I'm calling from the Tranquility Motel up here in Elko County. You, your former husband, and your daughter stayed here for a few days in July 2 summers ago?" Yes, we did. Miss Monatella, are either you or your daughter or your ex-husband having difficulties, frightening and extraordinary problems? This time her hesitation was pregnant with meaning. Is this some sick joke? Obviously you know what happened to Alan. Please, Miss Monatella, believe me. I don't know what happened to your ex-husband, but I do know there's a good chance that you or him or your daughter or all of you are suffering from inexplicable psychological problems, that you're having frightening and repetitive nightmares you can't remember, and that some of these nightmares involve the moon. She gasped twice in surprise as Dom was speaking, and when she tried to respond, she had difficulty talking. When he realized she was on the verge of tears, he interrupted. Miss Monatella, I don't know what's happened to you and your family, but the worst is past. The worst is past. Because whatever might still be to come, at least you're not alone anymore. Over 2,400 miles east of Elko County in Manhattan, Jack Twist spent Sunday afternoon giving away more money. On returning from the Guardmaster heist in Connecticut the previous night, he had driven through the city looking for those who were both in need and deserving, and he had not rid himself of all the cash until 5 o'clock in the morning. On the edge of physical and emotional collapse, he'd returned to his Fifth Avenue apartment, gone immediately to bed, and instantly to sleep. He dreamed again of the deserted highway and an empty moon-washed landscape, and of the stranger in the dark-visored helmet who pursued him on foot. As the moonlight suddenly turned blood-red, he woke from the dream in panic at 1 o'clock Sunday afternoon, flailing at his pillow. A blood-red moon. He wondered what that meant, if anything. He showered, shaved, dressed, and took time for only a quick breakfast consisting of an orange and a half-stale croissant. In the large walk-in closet that served the master bedroom, he removed the cleverly concealed false panel and inventoried the contents of the 3-foot-deep secret storage space. The jewelry from the job in October was finally gone, successfully fenced, and most of the money from the Fratellanza warehouse in early December had been converted to scores of cashier's checks and mailed to Jack's accounts at 3 Swiss banks. Only $125,000 remained, his emergency getaway fund. He transferred most of the cash to a briefcase, 9 banded packets of $100 bills, 100 bills in each, and 5 packets of $20 bills, 100 in each. That left $25,000 still in his cash, which seemed more than enough now that he was no longer involved in criminal activity and would not be putting himself in situations that might necessitate a swift exit from the state or country. Although Jack intended to dispose of a considerable portion of his ill-gotten wealth, he certainly did not plan to give away all of it and leave himself penniless. That might be good for his soul, but it would be bad for his future and undeniably foolish. However, he had 11 safe deposit boxes in 11 of the city's banks. Additional emergency caches in case he needed to escape but could not reach the money behind the false partition in his bedroom closet. And those caches contained more than another $250,000. His Swiss accounts were worth in excess of $4 million. It was far more than he needed. He was looking forward to shedding half of that fortune during the next couple of weeks, at which point he would pause to decide what he wanted to do with his future. Eventually, he might give away even more. At 3:30 Sunday afternoon, he carried his money-filled briefcase out into the city. All the strangers' faces, which for 8 years had seemed fiercely hostile, everyone now seemed like animated portraits of promise and dazzling possibilities. Everyone. The black kitchen smelled of coffee and hot chocolate, then of cinnamon and pastry dough, when Faye took a package of breakfast rolls from the freezer and popped them in the oven. While the others sat at the table listening, Dom continued to call the people who had registered at the motel on that special Friday night. He reached Jim Gestron, who turned out to be a photographer from L.A. Gestron had driven throughout the West that summer, shooting on assignment for Sunset and other magazines. Initially he was friendly, but as he heard more of Dom's story, he cooled off. If Gastron had been brainwashed, the mind control experts had been as successful with him as with Fay Block. The photographer was having no dreams, no problems. Dom's tale of brainwashing, somnambulism, nyctophobia, obsessions with the moon, suicides, and paranormal experiences struck Gastron as the babbling of a seriously disturbed person. He said as much and hung up in the middle of the conversation. Next, Dom called Harriet Bellet in Sacramento, who was no more trouble than Gastron. She was, she said, a 50-year-old unmarried school teacher who had developed an interest in the Old West when, as a young WAC, she was stationed in Arizona. Every summer she traveled old wagon train routes and visited the sites of the forts and Indian settlements of another age, usually sleeping in her little camper, but sometimes splurging on a motel room. She sounded like one of those likable, dedicated, but stern teachers who brook no nonsense from her pupils, and she brook none from Dom. When he started talking about fanciful stuff like poltergeist phenomena, she hung up too. "Does that make you feel better, Fay?" Ernie asked. "You're not the only one whose memories were so thoroughly scrubbed away." "Doesn't make me feel one damn bit better," Fay said. "I'd rather be suffering problems like you or Dom than feel nothing. I feel as if a piece of me was cut out and thrown away." Perhaps she's right, Dom thought. Perhaps nightmares, phobias, and terrors of one kind or another are better than having a little pocket of absolute emptiness inside, cold and dark, which would be like carrying a fragment of death around within her for the rest of her life. When Dominic Corvasis telephoned St. Bernadette's Rectory at 4:26 Sunday afternoon, seeking Brendan Cronin, Father Wyckowick was in the study with officers of the Knights of Columbus, concluding the first of many planning sessions for the annual St. Bernadette's Spring Carnival. At 4:30, Father Michael Girano interrupted with the news that the call he had just taken on the kitchen phone was from Father Wyckowick's cousin in Elko, Nevada. Only a few hours ago, one day ahead of schedule, Brendan Cronin had boarded a United flight to Reno, taking advantage of cancellations that had opened up some seats and intending to use a small commuter airline from Reno to Elko on Monday. At the moment, Brendan was still in the air with United, yet not yet even as far as Reno, and in no position to be calling anyone, so Michael's message intrigued Father Wyckowick and instantly pried him loose of the planning session without alerting the visitors that something extraordinary was happening in the lives of their parish clergy. Leaving the young priest to conclude matters with the knights, the rector hurried to the kitchen phone and took the call meant for Brendan. Dominic Corvasis, with a writer's appreciation for the fantastic, and Stefan, with a priest's appreciation for mystery and mysticism, became increasingly excited and voluble as they spoke to each other. VOLUBLE, as they spoke to each other. Stefan swept his knowledge of Brendan's problems and adventures, lost faith, miraculous cures, strange dreams. For Corvasis' stories of poltergeist phenomena, somnambulism, nyctophobia, lunar obsessions, and suicides. Finally, Stefan could not resist asking, "Mr. Corvasis, do you see any reason for an old, unregenerate religious like me to hold out the hope that what is happening to Brendan is somehow divine in nature?" "Quite frankly, Father, in spite of the miraculous cures of that police officer and the little girl you mentioned, I don't see the hand of God in this. There are too many indications of human connivery in this to support the interpretation you'd like to put on it." Stefan sighed. "I suppose that's true, but I'll still cling to the hope that what Brendan's being called to witness there in Nevada is something meant to bring him back into the hands of Christ. I won't give up on the possibility." The writer laughed softly. "Father, just from what I've learned of you during this conversation, I suspect you'd never give up on the possibility of redeeming any soul, anywhere, anytime. I'd guess you don't save souls quite the way other priests do, by finesse, by gentle and genteel encouragement. You strike me more as, well, as a blacksmith of the soul, hammering out the salvation of others by the sweat of your brow and the application of plenty of muscle. Please understand, I mean this as a compliment. Stefan laughed too. How else could I possibly take it? I firmly believe that nothing easy is worth doing. A blacksmith bent over a glowing forge? Yes, I do rather like the image. I'll look forward to Father Cronin's arrival here tomorrow. If he's anything like you, Father, we'll be glad to have him on our side. I'm on your side as well, Father Wyckowick said, and if there's anything I can do to help with your investigation, please call on me. If there is the slightest chance these strange events involve the manifest presence of God, then I do not intend to sit on the sidelines and miss all the action. The next entry on the guest list was for Bruce and Janet Cable of Philadelphia. Neither of them was having trouble of the sort that plagued Dom, Ernie, and the others. However, they were more willing to hear Dom out than Jim Gestron and Harriet Bellet had been, but in the end they were no more swayed by his story. The final name on the list was Thornton Wainwright, who had given a New York City address and telephone number. When Dom dialed it, he reached a Mrs. Neil Carpoli, who said the number had been hers for more than 14 years, and that she had never heard of Wainwright. When Dom read the Lexington Avenue address from the registry and inquired if that was where Mrs. Carpoli lived, she asked him to repeat it, then laughed. No, sir, that's not where I live, and your Mr. Wainwright's not a trustworthy sort if he told you that's his address. Nobody lives there, although I'm sure there are thousands who might enjoy it. I know I enjoyed working there. That's the address of Bloomingdale's. Sandy was astonished when Dom reported this news. Phony name and address? What's that mean? Was he really a guest that night? Or did someone add the name to the registry just to confuse us? Or what? Jack Twist possessed complete sets of sophisticated false IDs, driver's licenses, birth certificates, social security cards, credit cards, passports, even library cards, in 8 names, including Thornton Baines Wainwright, and he always employed an alias when planning and executing a heist. But he worked anonymously that Sunday afternoon, portioning out another $100,000 to startled recipients all over Manhattan. The largest gift was $15,000 to a young sailor and his bride of one day, whose battered old Plymouth had broken down on Central Park South, near the statue of Simon Bolivar. Get a new car, Jack told them as he stuffed money into their hands and playfully stuck a wad of bills under the sailor's hat. And if you're wise, you won't tell anyone about this, especially not the newspapers. That'll just bring the IRS down on you. No, you don't need to know my name, and there's no need to thank me. Just be kind to each other, all right? Always be kind to each other, because we never know how much time we have on this world. In less than an hour, Jack gave away the entire $100,000 that he had taken from the secret compartment in the back of his bedroom closet. With plenty of time on his hands, he bought a bouquet of coral red roses and drove out to Westchester County, an hour from the city, to the memorial park in which Jenny had been buried over 2 weeks ago. Jack had not wanted to put her to rest in one of the city's crowded and grim cemeteries. Although he knew he was being sentimental, he felt that the only suitable resting place for his Jenny was in open country, where there would be expansive green grassy slopes and shade trees in the summer and peaceful vistas of snow in the winter. He arrived at the memorial park shortly before twilight. Although the uniform headstones were set aflush with the earth, with no features to distinguish one from another, and although most of them were covered with snow, Jack went directly to Jenny's plot, the location of which was branded on his heart. While the dreary day faded into a drearier dusk, in a world colorless except for the blazing roses, Jack sat in the snow, oblivious of the dampness and cold, and spoke to Jenny as he had spoken to her during her years in a coma. He told her about the guardmaster heist yesterday, about giving away all the money. As the curtain of twilight pulled down the heavier drape of night, the Memorial Park security guard began driving slowly around the grounds, warning the few late visitors that the gates would soon close. Finally, Jack stood and took one last look at Jenny's name cast in bronze letters on the headstone plaque, now illuminated by the vaguely bluish light of one of the street lamps that lined the park's main drive. I'm changing, Jenny, and I'm still not sure why. It feels good, right, but also sort of strange. What he said next surprised him. Something big is going to happen, Jenny. I don't know what, but something big is going to happen to me. He suddenly sensed that his newfound guilt and subsequent peace with society were only the beginning steps of a great journey that would take him places he could not yet imagine. Something big is going to happen, he repeated, and I sure wish you were here with me, Jenny. The blue Nevada sky had been armoring itself with dark storm clouds ever since Ernie, Ned, and Dom had begun boarding up the diner's broken windows. Hours later, when Dom drove his rental car to the Elko airport to pick up Ginger Weiss, the world turned under a gloomy light girdled in battlefield gray. He was too restless to wait inside the small terminal. He stood on the windswept tarmac, huddled in his heavy winter jacket, so he heard the twin engines of the 10-seat commuter craft even before he saw it descend through the low clouds. The roar of the engines contributed to the mood of impending warfare, and Dom realized uneasily that, in a sense, they were assembling their army. War against their unknown enemy loomed nearer day by day. The plane taxied within 80 feet of the terminal, and Dr. Weiss was the fourth passenger to disembark. Even in a bulky, thoroughly unattractive car coat, she looked petite and beautiful. The wind made a streaming banner of her silky, silver-blonde hair. Dom hurried toward her. She stopped and put down her bags. They hesitated, staring at each other in silence, with a peculiar mixture of amazement, excitement, pleasure, and apprehension. Then, with an impulsiveness that obviously surprised her as much as it did him, they virtually threw themselves at each other, embracing as if they were old and dear friends too long apart. Dom held her close and she held him tightly, and he felt her heart pounding as hard and as fast as his. What the hell is happening here, he wondered. But he was in too much turmoil to analyze the situation. For the moment he could feel but not think. Neither of them wanted to let go, but when they finally separated, neither could speak. She tried to say something, but her voice cracked with emotion, and Dom was incoherent. So she picked up one of her bags, and he picked up the other, and they went out to the parking lot. In the car, with the engine running and the heater blowing warm air in their faces, Ginger said, "What was that all about?" Still shaken, but curiously not embarrassed by the bold greeting he had given her, Dom cleared his throat. "Don't really know, but I think maybe, together, you and I went through something so shattering that the experience created a special bond between us, a powerful bond we weren't entirely aware of until we saw each other in the flesh. When I first came across your picture on the book jacket, it had a very odd effect on me, but nothing like this. Stepping off the plane, seeing you there, it was as if we'd known each other all our lives. No, not exactly that. More precisely, it was as if we'd known each other far better, more completely than we'd ever known anyone else, as if we shared some tremendous secret that all the world might want to know, but that only we possessed. Does that sound crazy?" He shook his head. "No, not at all. You've put into words what I was feeling, as nearly as words can explain it." "You've met some of the others," Ginger said. "Was it like this when you first encountered them?" "No. I instantly felt a certain warmth toward them, a strong sense of community, but nothing a fraction as powerful as what I felt when you got off that plane. All of us went through something unusual that linked our lives, our futures. But evidently you and I shared an experience even stranger and more affecting than anything we shared with them. Damn, it's as layered as an onion, one strangeness on another." For half an hour they sat in the car in the airport parking lot talking. Outside, cars and pickups came and went around them, and the January wind buffeted the Chevy and moaned at the windows. However, they were seldom aware of anything but each other. She told him about her fugues, the hypnotic regression sessions with Pablo Jackson, and the mind control technique known as the Azrael block. She told him about Pablo's murder and her own narrow escape. Although clearly Ginger sought neither sympathy for her suffering nor praise for the way she had handled herself in trying circumstances, Dom's respect and admiration for her grew by the minute. She was only 5'2", 100 pounds, but somehow she had a physical presence more imposing than many men twice her size. Dom recounted the events of the past 24 hours, and when Ginger heard about his dream of the previous night and about the new memories that surfaced in it, she appeared immensely relieved. In Dom's dream, there was proof of Pablo Jackson's theory. Her fugues were not caused by mental aberration. They were instead always triggered by objects associated with her imprisonment at the motel 2 summers ago. The black gloves and dark visored helmet had terrified her because they made a direct connection with the repressed memories of the people in decontamination suits who tended her while she underwent brainwashing. The drain in the hospital scrub sank through the panic switch because she probably had been one of those detainees poisoned by Colonel Falkirk, whoever the hell he was, then forced to vomit up the deadly substance just as Dom had been. While strapped in the motel bed, she must have undergone many eye examinations to determine the depth of her drug-induced trance, which is why an ophthalmoscope had sent her reeling away in a dark terror that night in George Hannaby's office. Dom saw a relaxation of the tension at this irrefutable evidence that her blackouts were not a sign of madness and were, in fact, a desperate but entirely rational method of avoiding the repressed memories that the mind control experts had forbidden her to recall. She said, "But what about the brass buttons on the coat of the man who killed Pablo and on the policeman's uniform? Why did they terrify me and throw me into a fugue?" "We know the military is involved in this cover-up," Dom said, turning up the heater to counteract the cold air pouring off the car's wind-buffeted windows. "And officers' uniforms have brass buttons like that, though not a lion passant. Most likely raised images of eagles. The buttons on the killers' and cops' coats were probably similar to the buttons on the uniforms of those who imprisoned us in the motel." "Okay, but you said they wore decontamination suits, not uniforms." "Maybe they didn't wear the decon suits for the entire 3.5 days. At some point they decided it was safe to take them off." She nodded. "I'm sure that's right, which leaves only one thing. Those carriage lamps behind the house on Newberry Street, the day Pablo was murdered. I told you about them. Black iron with pebbled amber panes of glass. They had those bulbs that flickered like a gas flame, perfectly innocent lamps, but they kicked me into another blackout. The bases of the lamps in the rooms at the Tranquility Motel are designed like hurricane lamps with little windows of amber glass." "I'll be damned. So every blackout was triggered by an object that reminded me of something from those days when I was being brainwashed." Dom hesitated, then reached inside his sweater and withdrew the Polaroid photograph from his shirt pocket and handed it to her. She paled and shuddered when she saw herself staring up with vacant eyes at the camera. "Gewalt!" She looked away from the picture. Dom gave her time to recover from the shock of the snapshot. Outside in the fading, dirty gray light, a score of vehicles waited silently, like dark, dumb, brooding beasts. The wind harried collections of litter, dead leaves, and miscellaneous debris across the macadam. "It's Miss Sugar," she said, lowering her troubled gaze to the photo again. "It's crazy. What could possibly have happened to us that would justify this elaborate, risky conspiracy? What could we have seen that was so dreadfully goddamn important?" "We'll find out," he promised. "Will we? Will they let us? They killed Pablo. Won't they do whatever's necessary to keep us from uncovering the truth?" Adjusting the heater again, Dom said, "Well, I figure there are 2 factions among the conspirators. There are the hardasses represented by Colonel Falkirk and his people, and the better guys. Can't call them good guys exactly. represented by the fella who sent us these snapshots and by the 2 men in the decontamination suits in my dream last night. The hardasses wanted to kill all of us right at the start so there'd never be any doubt that the cover-up would be permanent. But the better guys wanted to scrub our memories, use mind control techniques instead of violence, so we could go on living. And the better guys must be the stronger of the 2 factions because they got their way. The gunman who killed Pablo was most likely one of the hardasses. Yeah, working for Falkirk. The colonel's evidently still willing to kill anyone who jeopardizes the cover-up, which means none of us is safe. But there's the other faction that doesn't believe in Falkirk's ultimate solution, and they're still trying to protect us, I think, so we have a chance. Anyway, we can't walk away. We can't go home and try to get on with our lives just because the enemy looks formidable. No, Ginger agreed, we can't. Because until we find out what happened, we don't really have lives to get on with. The wind blew withered leaves against the windshield over the roof. Ginger swept the parking lot with her gaze. They must know we're gathering at the motel, that things are falling apart. Do you think they're watching us now? Very likely they've got the motel under surveillance, Dom said. But no one followed me to the airport. I watched for a tail. They wouldn't need to tail you here, she said grimly. They knew where you were going. They knew who you were picking up. Are we laboring under a delusion of free will? Are we only bugs on a giant's palm, and can the giant crush us whenever he wants? Maybe, Ginger Weiss said, but by God, we can at least give him a couple of nasty bites before he smashes us. She spoke with a fierce determination that was convincing but also amusing in the context of a metaphor as basically comic as a giant and a bunch of bugs. Though he was pleased by her fierce resolution in the face of such overwhelmingly poor odds, Dom could not help laughing. Blinking at him in surprise, she laughed too. Hey, am I spunky or what? Might be smashed by a giant, but I feel triumphant, 'cause I'll be able to bite him just before he reduces me to a bloody smear. Spunky should be your middle name, Dom agreed, laughing harder. As he watched Ginger laughing at her own expense, Dom was again stricken by her beauty. His response to her, on seeing her disembark from the plane, had been instant and powerful because of unremembered experiences they shared. But even if they had been complete strangers whose lives had never crossed, he would have felt something more at the sight of her than he felt when he saw other beautiful women. Under any circumstances, she would have turned his head. She was special. He drew a breath. Shall I take you to meet the others? Oh, yes, she said, dabbing her slender fingers at the corners of her eyes to wipe away tears that her graveyard laughter had occasioned. Yes, I'm eager to meet them, the other bugs on the giant's hand. Less than half an hour before nightfall, the shadows on the high plains were long, and the muddy gray light of the overcast dusk lent an air of mystery even to such ordinary objects as clumps of sagebrush, rock formations, and twisted mounds of dead brown bunchgrass. Before taking her to the motel, Don Corvasis had brought Ginger to what he called the special place, more than 200 yards south of Interstate 80. The wind rustled half-seen vegetation. The ice on the grass and sagebrush, when glimpsed at all, looked black, shiny black. The rider stood away from her, hands jammed in his jacket pockets, silent. He had told her that he did not want to influence her reaction to the place, or color her first feelings with a description of his own. Ginger wandered slowly back and forth, feeling slightly foolish, as if taking part in a half-baked experiment in psychic perception, seeking clairvoyant vibrations. But she quickly stopped feeling foolish when the vibrations actually began to shake her. A queer uneasiness arose, and she found herself staying away from the deeper pockets of shadows, as if something hostile lurked in them. Her heart pounded. Uneasiness became fear, and she heard the tempo of her breathing change. It's inside me. It's inside me. She whirled toward that voice. It was Dom's voice, but it had not come from him. The words had been spoken behind her, but no one was there, only dry sagebrush and a thin patch of snow glowing softly, luminously within a nest of shadows. "What's the matter?" Dom asked, moving toward her. She was wrong. Dom's other voice, the ghostly-sounding voice, had not come from behind her. It had come from within her. She had heard that other Dom again, and she realized that she was hearing a fragment of memory, an echo from the past, something he had said to her that Friday night, July 6th, perhaps, when they had both stood in the same place. The scrap of memory came with no visual or olfactory element because it was part of the events locked behind the Azrael block. There were just those 3 urgent words repeated twice. "It's inside me. It's inside me." Abruptly, her simmering fear flashed bright. The landscape around her seemed to embody a nameless but monstrous threat. She started back toward the highway, walking fast, and Dom asked her what was wrong, and she walked even faster, unable to answer because fear was like a paste in her mouth and throat. He called her name, and she began to run. Every object in sight seemed to have been wounded on its eastern flank, for black blood shadows spilled in that direction. She was not able to speak until they were back in the Chevy with the doors locked, the engine running, and the heater blowing warm air on her chilled face. Shakily, she told him about the nameless threat she had felt on that ordinary-looking piece of ground, and about the memory of his urgent voice in the 3-word sentence. "It's inside me," he said thoughtfully. "You're sure it's really something I said to you that night?" "Yes," she shivered. "It's inside me. What in the world did I mean by that?" "I don't know," Ginger said, "but it gives me the creeps." He was silent a moment. Then he said, "Yeah, me too." That evening at the motel, Ginger Weiss felt almost as if she was with her family on a holiday gathering like Thanksgiving. In spite of the difficulties in which they found themselves, their spirits were high, for in the manner of a real family they drew strength from one another. The 6 of them crowded into the kitchen and prepared dinner together, and through that domestic labor Ginger got to know the others better and felt a strengthening of the ties that bound her to them. Ned Sarver, being a professional cook, prepared the main dish, chicken breast baked in a spicy green tomatillo sauce with sour cream. Initially, Ginger mistakenly thought Ned was a brooding, unfriendly sort, but she soon changed her opinion. Taciturnity sometimes could be a sign of a healthy ego that did not require constant gratification, which was the case with Ned. Besides, Ginger could not help but like a man who loved his wife as deeply as Ned loved Sandy, a love apparent in every word he spoke to her, in every glance he cast her way. Sandy, the only one of them to be affected only positively by their mysterious ordeal, was so sweet-tempered, so delighted with the recent changes in herself, that she was especially good company. Together, she and Ginger prepared the dinner salad and vegetables, and as they worked, an almost sisterly affection developed between them. Faye Block made the dessert, a refrigerator pie with a chocolate crust and banana cream filling. Ginger liked Faye, who reminded her of Rita Hanneby. That cultured society woman was different from Faye in many ways, but in fundamental respects they were alike. Efficient, take-charge types, tough of mind, tender of spirit. Ernie Block and Dom Corvasis put the extra leaf in the table and arranged 6 place settings. Ernie had seemed gruff and intimidating at first, but now she saw he was a sweetheart. He inspired much affection because of his fear of darkness, which made him seem boyish in spite of his size and age. Of the 5 people among whom Ginger found herself, only Dominic Corvasis stirred emotions that she could not understand. For him, she felt the same friendship that she felt for the others, and she was aware of a special bond between them related to an unremembered experience just the 2 of them had shared. But she was also sexually attracted to him. That surprised her because she never felt desire for a man until she knew him for several weeks at least, and knew him well. Wary of her romantic yearnings, Ginger kept a tight rein on her emotions, and she tried hard to convince herself that Dom did not feel a similar attraction for her, which he so patently did. Through dinner, the six of them continued to discuss their strange predicament and search for clues that might have been overlooked. Like Dom, Ginger had no recollection of the toxic spill 2 years ago, though the Blocks and Sarvers recalled it clearly. I-80 had really been closed and an environmental emergency had been declared. There was no doubt about that. Last night, however, Dom convinced the Blocks that their memories of evacuating to Elroy and Nancy Jamison's mountain ranch were phony, and that both they and the Jamisons had almost surely been kept at the motel. Parentheses, according to Faye and Ernie, the Jamisons had not mentioned having any nightmares or odd problems lately, so their brainwashing must have been effective, though it would be necessary to talk to them soon. Close parentheses. Likewise, Ned and Sandy had reluctantly concluded that their own recollections of sitting out the crisis at their trailer were too shallow to be real, and that they had been strapped into motel beds, drugged and brainwashed, like everyone else in those Polaroids. But, Faye wondered, why wouldn't they give us all approximately the same false memories? Ginger said maybe all you locals have had the toxic spill and the highway closure woven into your false memories. That'd be necessary because later people would be asking you where you went during the emergency, and you'd have to know what they were talking about. But Dom and I are from distant places, unlikely ever to return. Unlikely to run into anyone who would know that we'd been within the quarantine zone, so they didn't bother including that bit of reality in the set of fake memories they gave us. Sandy paused with a morsel of chicken on her fork, but wouldn't it be safer and easier to make your memories fit the toxic spill too? Ever since Pablo Jackson helped me discover that my mind had been tampered with, Ginger said, I've been reading about brainwashing, and I think maybe it's a lot less difficult to implant recollections that are entirely false than it is to weave in threads of reality, such as the environmental emergency and the road closure. It probably takes a lot longer to construct fake memories that have some reality to them, and maybe they simply didn't have time to do that with all of us, so they gave the super deluxe brainwashing job only to you locals. That feels like the truth, Ernie said, and everyone agreed. Faye said, but did the toxic spill really happen, or was it just a cover-up story that gave them an excuse to close I-80 and bottle us up, a way of preventing us from talking about what we'd seen Friday night? I suspect there was contamination of some sort, Ginger said. In Dom's nightmare, which we know is really more memory than dream, those men were wearing decontamination suits. Now, when they came into the quarantine zone, maybe they'd wear costumes like that for the benefit of newsmen or other onlookers. But once here, where only we could see them, they wouldn't keep the suits on unless they absolutely had to. Glancing uneasily at the blind-covered window nearest the table, as if he thought he had seen a trickle of darkness dribbling in from the night beyond, Ernie cleared his throat and said, Yeah, well, which was it, do you think? You're the doctor. Does it sound like chemical or biological contamination? The story they gave the media was that it involved chemicals being delivered to Schenkfield's testing facilities. Ginger had been thinking about this question for some time, long before Ernie asked it. Chemical or biological contamination? She had arrived at an answer that deeply disturbed her. Generally speaking, the suits required for a chemical spill don't have to be airtight. They just have to cover the worker from head to toe in order to prevent any caustic or toxic substance from coming into contact with his skin. And they have to include a respirator, rather like a scuba diver's tank and mask, so he won't breathe deadly fumes. They're usually made of lightweight, non-porous cloth, and the headgear consists of a simple cloth hood with a plastic visor. But Dom described heavy-looking suits with an outer level of thick vinyl, with gloves that were of one piece with the sleeves, and a hard helmet that locked into an airtight seal at the collar. That is unquestioningly gear that's been designed to prevent exposure to a dangerous biological agent, microbes. For a while, no one said a word, pondering this disquieting news. Then Ned took a long swallow of his Heineken for fortification and said, "So we must have been infected with something." Faye said, "Some virus they developed for biological warfare." "If it was headed for Schenkfield, that's the only kind of bug it could have been," Ernie said. "Something mean." "Yet we lived," Sandy said. "Because they were immediately able to quarantine us and treat us," Ginger said. "Surely they wouldn't be intending to test a genetically engineered virus, some new and deadly organism that could be used as a weapon, unless they had simultaneously developed an effective cure for it. So they had a supply of a new antibiotic or serum to guard against just such an accident. If they contaminated us, they also cured us." Ernie said, "It sounds right, doesn't it? Maybe it's all starting to fall together, piece by piece." Dom disagreed. "It still doesn't explain what happened on that Friday night, what we saw that they didn't want us to see. It doesn't explain what made the whole damn diner shake or what blew out the windows, either on that first night or again last night. And it doesn't explain the other weird stuff," Faye said, "like all those paper moons whirling around Dom and Lomax's house, or Father Wykezik's claim that this young priest's been performing miracle cures." They looked at one another, waiting in silence for someone to put forth an explanation that would tie biological contamination with those paranormal events, but no one had an answer. Less than 300 miles west of the Tranquility Motel, in another motel in Reno, Brendan Cronin had gone to bed and turned out the lights. Although it was only a few minutes after 9 o'clock, he was still functioning on Chicago time, so for him it was after 11. However, sleep eluded him. After checking into the motel and having dinner at a nearby Bob's Big Boy, he had telephoned St. Bet's Rectory and had spoken with Father Wykezik, who had told him of the call from Dominic Corvasis. Brendan was electrified by the news that he was not the only one caught up in this mystery. He considered calling the Tranquility, but they already knew he was on his way, and whatever they could say on the phone could be said better in person tomorrow. Thoughts of tomorrow and speculations about what might happen were what kept sleep at bay. He had lain awake less than an hour, and his thoughts had drifted to the eerie luminescence that had filled his rectory bedroom 2 nights ago, when suddenly that phenomenon appeared once more. This time there was no visible source of light, not even one so unlikely as the frost moon upon the window from which the uncanny radiance had sprung last Friday night. Now the glow appeared above him and on all sides, as if the very molecules of the air had acquired the ability to produce light. It was a lunar pale milky shimmer at first, growing brighter by the second until it seemed as if he must be lying in an open field under the looming countenance of a full moon. This was different from the peaceful golden light that was featured in his recurring dream, and as it had done 2 nights ago, it filled him with conflicting emotions, horror and rapture, fear and wild excitement. As in his rectory bedroom, the lactescent light changed color, darkening to scarlet. He seemed suspended in a radiant bubble of blood. "It's inside me," he thought, wondering what that meant. Inside me. The thought reverberated in his mind. Suddenly he was cold with fear. His thundering heart seemed about to explode. He lay rigid. In his hands the rings appeared, throbbing.